Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For today's episode, I'm joined once again by Dr. John Van Stand, a professor at Cleveland State University in the Department of Biological, Geological, and Environmental Sciences. He also runs an independent press, the Press of a Ridiculous Man, and you can find their publications on Amazon. Dr. Van Stand was here today to talk about his recent BioScience article, A Cautionary Tale About Urban Trees. Could ecosystem monetary estimates become economic sleights of hand? It's a great article, very engaging, and we had a wonderful chat. So with no further ado, let's go to the interview. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to chat, and I'm excited to chat again.
Likewise. All right, so let's get in and start by talking a little bit about the idea of the valuation of ecosystem services. Kind of what is that concept, and how do we find ourselves performing this act of valuing ecosystem services?
Great. Well, I think we can begin with the idea that most of us who live in a city want a place near a park or a leafy street. Big trees, shade, and so on. Why? It's not just looks. Those bits of nature do things for us. They make places beautiful, they calm our nerves, they cool our blocks, clean some air, and even nudge property values up. In a way, ecosystem services got priced the moment people paid more to live near more green. Say, to live closer to Central Park in New York City. And so at the start of our article, we imagine a city hall meeting about what to do with a block of street trees. The planner talks in dollars and parcels. The water scientist talks in rain kept out of storm drains. A climate advocate talks of tons of CO2 stored in the trees. Public health could point to stress and heat relief. All different benefits, all different units, but still the same tree. So ecosystem valuation is the translator. It turns those different benefits into a common frame, often dollars, of course, so we can compare, budget, and plan. Done carefully, it helps cities protect what nature already does well, and to invest smarter, planting the right trees in the right places, keeping them healthier longer, and sharing the benefits across the whole community, including benefiting the ecosystem itself.
And that makes sense. And, as a layperson, I've often liked this idea because, I kind of figured that most decisions are made on this sort of monetary basis, or at least that financial element will certainly play into decision making, and it's probably a great thing to at least get decision makers and stakeholders to consider the fact that something like a stand of nice trees is something that's of value. But it's not quite that simple, though. There are some problems with doing this, and I was hoping you could kind of illuminate us as to what sorts of things those might be.
Yeah, well, when we try to turn nature into a financial ledger, trying to balance costs and benefits, some problems do pop up. Certainly parts of an ecosystem's value are easy to count. Stormwater avoided, like that water scientist, or carbon stored, like the climate activist, or energy saved. Those slide neatly into dollars to some degree. There's still some worries there, but other values are far more stubborn. Cultural meaning, a sense of place, mental health co-benefits, social cohesion. These are real, but hard to measure. Because they're hard to quantify, they often get rounded down, misestimated, or dropped entirely. Now put that in a city where land is expensive, and then green and blue spaces are competing with high-value development. If our ledger only includes the easy-to-count stuff, nature shows up cheaper than it truly is. That's how an accounting tool can become unintentionally a kind of economic sleight of hand. What we don't measure seems not to matter. And, well, once a value disappears from the valuation, it tends to disappear from the decision. Parks shrink, trees lose.
So what elements, kind of slip away in that type of environment? What sort of things do we fail to, properly value, and, why do they lose?
So we can miss things in a variety of ways. We can fail to properly value even the concrete stuff. In fact, when we try to put a dollar value on a whole park, we often start with something concrete, like how much rain the tree canopy keeps out of storm drains. Sounds straightforward, but even that isn't. Most of that action happens above our heads, difficult to see. We measure rain at a gauge over here, infer what hit the canopy over there, and collect what drips to the ground. The models that convert those scraps of data into runoff avoided, well, they're useful, but they are simplified. If we lean too hard on them, we can quietly underestimate how much water the canopy actually stores and evaporates. Then, let's come to the harder-to-see bits, like what's the real biodiversity in the canopy? That's tough to sample, and pretty easy to gloss over with a rough statistic. What about processes we barely measure, or don't even realize we're missing? Take lichens and mosses, the small non-vascular communities living on bark and on branches. Well, these tiny guys soak up water, take in carbon, and influence nitrogen cycling. Yet they're usually left out of the spreadsheets. When they're excluded, their contributions vanish from the value column, and too often from decisions. So in our paper, we include them, and, well, I won't say any more to avoid spoilers, but when lichens and mosses and other canopy residents aren't estimated in the valuation, we can end up losing their contributions and pretending like they don't exist at all.
And on the other side of that ledger, you have somebody who's, kind of coming forth, perhaps a developer or something going, we are going to build X amount of retail space, which over the past, several decades has demonstrated the capacity to produce this amount of revenue and economic productivity. And so you're essentially in a way making a very complex evaluation and comparing it to something that's much simpler, coming from the side of development or whatever else it might be.
Oh yeah, developers? Look, a very large part of their job is to demonstrate economic value, very concretely, and it's a good job. I'm glad they do it. They provide a real service to the community, especially when land is developed in a way that supports communities and the well-being of that community's broader ecosystem. But economics as a field, it grew up to support development, to evaluate human interests and how projects serve those interests. So developers tend to have very good accounting of the impacts and benefits that their projects will bring somewhere. But we didn't build nature from scratch, not in the human sense. We don't have all the design pieces laid out. That's one of the big challenges in ecosystem science. What is doing what, and how important is each part? So, if we're being honest with ourselves, we often don't know that. At the same detail of level economists have for a land development pro forma, that gap makes valuation pretty hard. And in cities, the bar is even higher. Urban land carries sky-high opportunity costs, so a park has to look very valuable just to compete. Green space has to beat the highest and best use number before the ecology even gets a hearing. If we're missing things, especially benefits beyond the purely physical, like belonging, culture, or the mental health value of that park to the community, stuff I'd mentioned earlier, then parks get undervalued from the start. Those are already challenging to estimate, even when people share definitions. But cities have an extra interesting layer. They are cosmopolitan. There are many cultures and many viewpoints on mental health and on nature's role and well-being, so traditional development accounting doesn't really have to wrestle with that. Ecosystem service accounting, however, it does. And those are precisely the values our tools tend to undercut, not because they're unimportant, but because they're hard to price.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things also that was raised in the article that I think might be worth chatting about for a little bit is the concept of money itself. So it's not only the tools that we use to value ecosystem services, but in some senses there are some challenges that are afforded by, the very structure in which we're doing that valuation. So can you just tell us a little bit about money for a moment and, kind of how we might think about it?
Money is a fascinating idea. And when I started this paper, my understanding was pretty hazy. I'm actually pretty grateful to the economists who humored my constant question. They'd give me an answer, and then I would say again, but what is money really? They offered the classic trio in the end. Money is a medium of exchange. It lets us trade across space and time. A unit of account, a common measuring stick for prices and comparisons of stuff, and a store of value, so it preserves purchasing power over time. Well, at least in principle. and you can see why that makes money feel like a great proxy for ecological truths. We might say that this tree stores this much carbon. All right, well, that carbon has a price we can trade across space and time, and so that we have a medium of exchange. Well, then that price gives us a unit of account, and even if we don't trade it now, the value can be stored. But talking with economists also surfaced the leaks in each function. You see, as a unit of account, money is only a proxy. If externalities are ignored or incentives are skewed, well, both common in environmental contexts, things that look comparable on paper can be wildly different in lived and ecological reality. As a medium of exchange, money routinely misses non-market exchanges like mutual aid and reciprocity, and it's distorted by unequal access to information, exactly the kind of asymmetry you find among diverse stakeholders in environmental decisions, especially in cities. And let's see, as a store of value, the container is leaky. Inflation erodes it. Speculation warps it. Diminishing marginal utility means more money doesn't linearly map to worth. And cultural or existential value rarely translates cleanly into markets. So in short, money is what most hard scientists might call an unstable proxy. And well, in the sciences where we're trying to find stable laws, stable measures, repeatable things, money becomes a challenge in that frame.
Yeah, so it sounds like we've got a lot of different challenges going on already. We have, the difficulty of putting a monetary value on an ecosystem service, and we have, of course, problems with the unit of measure that we're using itself. And I would imagine another difficulty might be the fact that, we have so many different people working on an ecosystem and doing those valuations potentially. We've got hydrologists who are measuring where the water goes. We have social scientists who are measuring the value of an ecosystem service and providing mental health services to people in the community. It's just a lot of different folks that are going to be kind of looking at this, and I would imagine that makes things rather difficult.
Oh yeah. In fact, that was also a challenge in just writing this essay. Many of my co-authors come from fields where I'm not a direct expert. Philosophers working on monism and continental thought, and people who build tools to quantify ecosystem values. I've got folks with GIS analysis skills who assess cultural values. And so, from first-hand experience, the hard part was serving as a translator, while also trying to keep the translators honest. Like making sure that measures aren't prematurely converted into dollars, and that ideas like value or justice aren't flattened into utility curves. Basically, we're trying to let each of these language games be heard, while staging a negotiation toward shared understanding. It's a big challenge and, probably never perfect. I doubt I got it perfect, but I think that there are a few ways for us to kind of blend metrics, like dollars and biophysical units and plural values, all to help economists and policymakers to better manage urban green spaces and blue spaces and so on.
Yeah, and I'd like to get into, talking about sort of a better way forward in a moment. But since you brought it up, why don't you tell us a little bit about, kind of how this article came together? This is always something that I, wonder about from the editorial perspective where, I see the paper when it kind of, comes in as a submission and not before that. What was the process like of drawing this one together?
Oh, this one was a fun process. Listeners might not know this is the second Thinking on Biology essay I've done with BioScience. The first one was me talking with a bunch of different scientists about things that we were missing by not being personally present in a storm. This one was quite different. It began as a conversation with a philosopher who studies monism. In other words, who studies the basic units we use to understand reality. Talking with him about different kinds of monads, the fundamental units of existence that philosophers theorize about. Well, that made me realize that when people come together to discuss how to manage nature, we each carry our own kind of monad in mind. The hydrologist, basically me, I show up with the monad of water. thinking in things like cubic meters moving from one place to another or stored in one place or another. Another monad could be some units of carbon. Kevin Mueller, my buddy on the paper who's primarily interested in plant traits, especially around carbon and some other stuff as well, might use that unit. And so, talking to the monist philosopher, and then to a bunch of other scientists about a common cause, led me to this idea. Maybe our use of money is an attempt to find common language, what philosophers call a common ontology, a common way of seeing reality. And while that's important, we can accidentally use a monad like money as a translator, and then let it redefine reality, instead of represent it. And that's where the conversation began. I started pulling in people from economics, from philosophy, from ecosystem service valuation, and started asking, is this an unexplored space? Applying the monism monad concept here, and where could it go? Those discussions led us to what we call monetary monism, or monetarianism, and this is the idea that we can unintentionally let money redefine reality, not just translate between nature and economics.
And perhaps we could talk about hydrology or any other area that you think would be a good representative. But how does that monetary monism fall short as a way of understanding just any sort of exemplar concept or field?
Yes, we throw a few examples into the paper on the way to and through the story. But real quick aside, something I really like about this paper is that it's written as a cautionary tale. So we begin with a story, and we end with that story, but in between we unpack the philosophy and some concrete examples. One of the problems we highlight, we can value carbon these days pretty well, depending on place and context. Oddly, you start to see papers talking not just about managing for carbon, but prioritizing by the monetary value of carbon, including in agricultural systems, without adjusting for other pressing issues like nitrogen overload, a big one in ag. And in one example we discuss, and we don't have a problem with the paper itself, by the way, but the analysis focuses on carbon at large scales, again important. But the nitrogen problems from saturation in agricultural settings, they don't take center stage, even though there's some agricultural discussion. So many perspectives that don't dive into the economic view and just look at the nitrogen cycle itself would say, well, we should be paying attention to this a lot more. It's not that both aren't important. It's that monetary framing can conflate or complicate which of the priorities you choose to pursue.
Okay, so this is rounding up to be a very tricky situation. We have issues with the act of, translating ecosystem services into monetary values. We have challenges related to the fact that it takes a lot of people to do it. And we have issues, with the underlying structure and, types of measures that we're using. But at the same time, we have stakeholders and decision makers who are going to make their decisions on some sort of basis. And the basis that they seem to like to use, at least very broadly speaking, is something like a revenue projection or another monetary measure. How do we kind of move forward and get decisions that are made off of not purely this monetary monad type of structure?
Undoubtedly, there's a way. And if I could put the way forward in this paper into some sort of tagline, it would be keep dollars, but make it dollars and. So, when we talk about economic valuation of ecosystem services versus what we call monetary monism, the difference is really this. Economic valuation is a representation, and we all remember that it's a representation. Monetary monism, however, forgets that, and it starts treating the stacks of money estimated for the tree as reality, or very close to it, managing the forest as such in this case. So, keep dollars, but add physical units. Maybe that's another tagline. Keep dollars, but add physical units. The cubic meters of stormwater. The kilograms of particulate pollutants that trees capture. Shifts in canopy albedo and urban cooling. And Add some place-based values that resist pricing. Add heritage, add access, add mental health, add the things we've been talking about and others like it. For the dollars piece, of course, we should do something there. We'd favor designs tied to actual transactions. There are real success stories out there. We couldn't find some for really dense urban environments, but we certainly could find some like the water funds in Quito, or like mangrove insurance in Mexico, and broader attempts to make payments for ecosystem services, even in national accounts. See, it could be a problem if there is a monetary value for these ecosystem services, and yet the money is nowhere. Does it even exist then? So we would say the closer the money mirrors the biophysics, the better this bridge is between economics and nature. So we have to build better bridges, and we think we can, and we keep dollars firmly in the lane of representation, and we do this by foregrounding the physical units. Put that up front. Then maybe we get a more honest, usable picture of value.
That makes sense to me, and I think that would probably be a fantastic point on which to, kind of close us out and leave the conversation. But I'm going to mess us up instead.
Yeah, let's do it.
I wanted to highlight one thing and just ask a question about it, which is one of the really fun things about this article is the fact that it is presented, as you mentioned, as a cautionary tale, and it's a really lively piece of storytelling that I encourage everyone to read, and I'll include a link in the show notes, of course. But how did that idea come about, and what led you to take that approach?
Indeed, the storyline approach. Well, during my conversations with philosophers, I noticed something. On the continental side, there's still a bit of playfulness in how articles are written. Not all philosophy is playful, of course, and not all continental philosophy. Some of it can be quite dense and very unplayful in a way. But historically, there's also a lot of playfulness in that side. So there was a lot of discussion about how to write this one at first, because the analytical, philosophical style, well, that's very different from the scientific, theoretical style of writing manuscripts. All these different writing styles were thus on the table. And I've always had a soft spot for cautionary tales. I read a lot from the late 1800s and early 1900s on Gutenberg, where a Victorian or post-Victorian voice takes an idea and shows how it could go very, very wrong. So I floated that to the team and started drafting the introduction. A lot of skepticism at first, of course, but I started with a city hall meeting where people are deciding the fate of a beloved green space. They're talking past each other, of course, and then they hit the realization that they need to standardize their language. I wrote that up, and folks read it, and then they said, "Oh, cool, okay, we see it. Let's start there. Let's dig into the philosophical storylines afterwards. Let's gather examples along the way." And so that pushed us to portion out the work. Who tackles the philosophy? Who brings the data? Who frames the valuation? And so on. Then, after all of that was compiled, I circled back to close the loop. The characters reconvene at the end. They agree they need a common language, and they choose money as that language, but instead of a standard practitioner who says, "Here's a representation of money," well, we bring in a monetarianist, a monetary monist, who arrives with a tool and tries to convince them that the monetary outputs are reality. And when that pitch lands, it leads to a cautionary ending. How's that?
That is perfect, and I think our listeners will be very well served to become readers. That is a fantastic character, and it's really a fun article that I urge everyone to read. You'll find, of course, a link in the show notes, and I thank you very much for joining me today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been a fun chat.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.